Hey there, fellow knowledge seekers. Ready for a deep dive into something really fascinating?
Always.
Today, we're going to be exploring the Quran.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, it's the central text of Islam,
Okay.
which is a faith with, what, over 1.5 billion followers worldwide?
Wow. Yeah.
We're not just looking at it as a religious text, though. Think of this as a journey into, like, literature, history, and even, like, the evolution of the Arabic language itself. Okay, let's unpack this.
Sounds good.
So what's captivating about the Quran?
Well, the Quran, it's really multifaceted. Muslims believe it to be the literal word of God, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad over 1,400 years ago.
Okay.
But it's also a literary masterpiece. It's a historical document and a source of, ongoing philosophical and ethical reflection.
That's so interesting. And it's all written in classical Arabic,
Yes.
which is a language known for its incredible depth and nuance.
Yes.
Imagine a single word for friend having layers of meaning depending on the context.
Right, exactly.
That's the beauty of classical Arabic.
Absolutely. And the richness of the language is inseparable from how the Qur'an is understood and interpreted. It's not just the words themselves, but the rhythm, the rhyme, the intricate literary devices woven throughout the text that all contribute to its impact.
Yeah. So how is the Quran structured? It's not like a typical book with a beginning, middle, and end. Right?
Yeah, you're right. It's not a chronological narrative.
Yep.
The Qur'an is composed of 114 chapters called surahs.
Okay.
Each one's divided into verses called ayahs.
Okay.
Think of an ayah as like a signpost, offering guidance or a piece of wisdom. And here's where it gets interesting. The surahs aren't arranged in the order they were revealed.
Okay, so we have these 114 surahs.
Yes.
Each with its own set of ayahs, but they're not in chronological order. That definitely adds to the intrigue. Any theories about why?
Yeah, well, there are various theories about the arrangement of the surahs,
Right.
which we'll delve into a little bit later.
Right.
For now, just keep in mind that it adds another layer of complexity to how the Qur'an is studied and interpreted.
It definitely makes you think. So let's get to the heart of it. What are the Quran's big ideas? Like the core messages it conveys?
Well, the central theme that weaves through the Qur'an is tawhid,
Okay.
the concept of absolute monotheism.
Got it.
It emphasizes the oneness and unity of God, rejecting any form of idolatry or associating partners with God. The Qur'an uses many names and attributes for God, like all-knowing, all-powerful, and the just, highlighting his diverse qualities.
And so recognizing God's unique and absolute power is paramount, like with no other deities sharing the stage.
Precisely. This idea of monotheism was revolutionary in 7th century Arabia, challenging the prevailing polytheistic beliefs.
It makes you consider the historical context and the profound impact this message must have had.
Absolutely. Speaking of impact, the Quran doesn't just discuss God in isolation.
Right.
It also highlights the role of prophets and messengers throughout history.
Right. Figures like Abraham, Moses, and Jesus are all mentioned in the Quran.
Yes. Muslims believe God sent prophets to guide humanity towards truth and righteousness. They consider Muhammad the final prophet, and the Quran the culmination of God's message.
So it builds on those earlier traditions and presents itself as the final revelation.
In a way, yes. The Quran sees itself as completing and perfecting the messages revealed through previous prophets. Another key theme intertwined with this idea of guidance is the concept of the afterlife.
Okay, tell me more about that. What does the Quran say about what happens after we die?
The Quran emphasizes accountability for one's actions and belief in a day of judgment. People will be held accountable for their needs and rewarded or punished accordingly.
So there's a strong sense of justice and consequence. Good deeds are rewarded and bad deeds have repercussions.
Exactly. The Quran often uses vivid imagery and descriptions of paradise and hell, contrasting ultimate joy and suffering to underscore the importance of choosing a righteous path.
I can see how those descriptions would leave a lasting impression. It's not just about abstract concepts. It's about painting a vivid picture of what awaits in the afterlife.
Right. Now, beyond these core religious themes, it's essential to acknowledge the Quran's monumental impact on Arabic literature. It established classical Arabic as the gold standard for literary expression.
And here's where it gets really interesting. I read that the Quran's use of language is considered miraculous. Like it really set a high bar.
Indeed.
Yeah.
The Quran is renowned for its sophisticated use of rhetoric and literary devices. Rhyme, rhythm, and repetition are all masterfully employed, not only enhancing its beauty, but also aiding memorization and recitation. Remember, oral tradition was paramount at that time.
It's like the perfect fusion of form and function. Beautiful language meant to be easily remembered and transmitted across generations.
Precisely. The challenge was for anyone to produce something comparable to the Qur'an in eloquence and literary excellence. Even the Qur'an's staunchest opponents couldn't replicate its quality, which further solidified its status as divine revelation.
So to sum up, we have a text that makes bold claims about God, prophets, and the afterlife, all while being considered linguistically unmatched. That's pretty powerful stuff.
It is. To fully grasp that power, we need to understand the historical context in which the Qur'an emerged.
Okay.
Let's take a quick journey back to 7th century Arabia.
Lead the way. I'm ready for a history lesson.
Imagine Arabia in the 7th century, a diverse place with various religious communities and rich oral traditions. This is where the Prophet Muhammad comes in. He's born in Mecca, a bustling trade center,
Okay.
and begins receiving revelations from God.
And he starts preaching this radical message of monotheism, which I'm guessing didn't sit well with everyone.
You're right, it was met with resistance.
Okay.
Muhammad faced significant opposition,
Right.
especially from the powerful tribes of Mecca who were deeply invested in the existing polytheistic system.
So what happened? Did they just ignore him? I doubt that.
Ignoring him wasn't an option.
Right.
He gained followers, and the message spread, which further angered his opponents. This ultimately led to the Hijra, the Prophet's migration from Mecca to Medina in 622 CE.
Ah, the Hijra. That's a pivotal moment in Islamic history.
It was. The migration to Medina marked a turning point. It allowed the early Muslim community to flourish and eventually return to Mecca in a position of strength.
So the Qur'an's revelation begins in Mecca, faces opposition, then finds a foothold in Medina. It's a story of resilience and ultimate triumph.
Exactly. And after the Prophet's death, the Qur'an, which had been preserved in both written fragments and the memories of his companions, was compiled into a single authoritative text.
That ensured the message's preservation and transmission to future generations. It's incredible how those events from centuries ago continue to shape beliefs and practices today.
It is. The Qur'an's journey from revelation to compilation is a story of faith, perseverance, and the power of words to transform individuals and societies.
And it's not just about preserving the words themselves, right? It's also about capturing the unique style and spirit of the Quranic language. Let's delve deeper into that.
It truly is. It's about appreciating the Qur'an's literary features, its use of rhetoric, metaphor, and symbolism, all of which contribute to its impact and enduring appeal.
So can you give me like an example? Like what kind of literary devices can we find in the Quran?
Well, one striking feature is the use of vivid imagery and metaphors.
Okay.
To convey abstract concepts, for instance, the Qur'an often describes God's attributes using metaphors drawn from nature, like the sun, the moon, or the vastness of the sky.
So it's making these complex theological ideas relatable through imagery that resonates with people.
Precisely.
Kind of like poetry.
Precisely. And like poetry, the Qur'an uses rhythm and rhyme schemes
Okay.
to enhance its beauty and memorability. This was particularly crucial given the emphasis on recitation and memorization.
It's like a symphony of words carefully crafted to create a powerful and lasting impact. You know, I read somewhere that the Quran actually challenged people to imitate its style.
You're absolutely right. The Qur'an itself claims its literary excellence is unmatched.
Wow.
And challenges people to produce something comparable. This challenge, in a way, became a testament to the Qur'an's unique literary power.
So even those who didn't believe in its divine origin had to acknowledge its literary brilliance. That's fascinating. It almost becomes a historical artifact, a window into the linguistic landscape of the time.
Exactly. It offers valuable insights into the culture and literary values of 7th century Arabia. Speaking of history, let's dig a bit deeper into the historical backdrop against which the Qur'an was revealed. We've discussed the Prophet Muhammad, but what else was happening in Arabia at that time?
Yeah, paint us a picture of the world back then. Were there other religions present? What was the political climate like?
Arabia in the 7th century was a diverse and dynamic place.
Okay.
You had various religious communities, including Christians, Jews, and those who followed indigenous Arab polytheistic beliefs. It was also a time of political and economic shifts, with trade routes connecting Arabia to major empires like the Byzantine and Persian empires.
So it wasn't some isolated backwater. It was a crossroads of cultures and commerce.
Yeah. Exactly. Mecca, where the Prophet Muhammad was born, was a major trading hub, a place where different ideas and beliefs intersected.
And into this mix comes the message of the Quran with its radical emphasis on monotheism.
Yes.
It's almost like a cultural earthquake, shaking things up and challenging the existing order.
It was definitely disruptive. The Quran's message critiqued the social inequalities and injustices prevalent in Mecca at the time, challenging the status quo.
So it wasn't just about abstract theological ideas. It had real-world implications for how society was structured.
Absolutely. And this is reflected in the Quran's emphasis on ethical conduct, social justice, and taking care of the vulnerable, which we'll discuss more later.
Okay, so we have this fascinating historical backdrop, a society in flux, and the Quran emerges as a catalyst for change.
Yes.
It must have been a truly transformative period.
It was. To understand the Quran's impact, we need to keep this historical context in mind. It helps us see how the Quran addressed the specific challenges and realities of its time.
All right, so we've covered the Quran's big ideas, its impact on Arabic literature and the historical context, but how did people actually receive this message? Was it an instant hit, or was there resistance?
Well, like any radical message, it received a mixed response. Some were drawn to its message of monotheism, its call for justice and righteousness, while others felt threatened by its challenge to the established order.
I can imagine the power dynamics at play.
Yeah.
Those in power probably weren't thrilled about a message that challenged their authority and privilege.
Exactly, and this opposition is something the Quran itself acknowledges.
Right.
In fact, a significant portion of the Quran deals with how to respond to skeptics and those who reject its message.
So there's a dialogue happening within the Quran itself, addressing doubts, offering arguments, and engaging with different viewpoints.
Precisely, and understanding this internal dialogue is crucial for appreciating the Quran's depth and sophistication. It's not just a one-sided proclamation, it's a dynamic engagement with those who question and challenge its claims.
So we're not just passive recipients of information. We're invited to participate in this dialogue, to grapple with the ideas and form our own understanding.
Exactly, and that's what makes studying the Quran such a rewarding experience. It's not just about acquiring knowledge, it's about engaging in a process of critical thinking and reflection.
I love that. I love that. It's not a static text. It's a living conversation that continues to resonate across centuries.
And part of what keeps that conversation alive is the Quran's unique structure and the way it weaves together different themes and narratives.
Okay, let's talk more about that structure. We touched on it earlier, but I'm curious to know more about how the Quran is organized and how that organization contributes to its meaning.
Remember those 114 surahs we talked about?
Yeah.
Well, they're not arranged chronologically, which might seem a bit confusing at first.
Yeah, it's not like reading a history book where everything unfolds in a neat timeline.
Mm-hmm.
So how do scholars make sense of this arrangement?
Scholars have identified various ways to understand the Quran's structure. Some have focused on thematic groupings, while others have looked at the historical context in which each surah was revealed.
So it's like a puzzle with different pieces fitting together to create a larger picture.
Exactly, and one of the most common ways to categorize the surahs is based on whether they were revealed in Mecca or Medina.
Ah, so the location of the revelation plays a role in how we understand the content of the surahs.
It does. Meccan surahs, those revealed before the Prophet's migration to Medina, tend to focus on core theological concepts like God's oneness, the Day of Judgment, and the stories of earlier prophets.
So it's setting the foundation, laying out the fundamental principles of Islam.
Right, while Medinan surahs revealed after the migration tend to address more practical matters related to governing a community's social interactions and legal rulings.
So it's like moving from theory to practice, from establishing belief to building a society based on those beliefs.
Precisely, and this distinction between Meccan and Medinan surahs is crucial for understanding the Quran's evolution and how its message addressed the changing needs of the early Muslim community.
This is also fascinating. It's like peeling back layers of history and meaning to uncover the richness of the Quran.
It is. And speaking of uncovering meaning, let's talk about another fascinating aspect of the Quran, its use of narratives, particularly those borrowed from earlier scriptures like the Bible.
Okay, so we're going even deeper now, exploring how the Quran interacts with and reinterprets familiar stories.
Right, you'll find stories of Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, Moses, and the Exodus, and even Jesus, all woven into the fabric of the Quranic narrative.
But they're not just copy-pasted, right? The Quran puts its own spin on these tales, doesn't it?
Exactly. The Quran retells these stories with a specific purpose in mind, emphasizing certain themes, drawing new lessons, and connecting them to its broader message of monotheism and submission to God's will.
It's like taking a familiar melody and adding new harmonies, creating a fresh and insightful interpretation.
That's a great way to put it. This reinterpretation is key to understanding how the Quran positions itself within the larger Abrahamic tradition, while asserting its own distinct message.
It's like a conversation across time and scriptures, a dialogue between different revelations. It makes you realize that religious texts aren't isolated entities. They exist in relation to each other, influencing and shaping each other's meanings.
You've hit the nail on the head. The Quran isn't just a book, it's an active participant in an ongoing religious and cultural dialogue.
This is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see the Quran in a whole new light, not just as a religious text, but as a literary masterpiece, a historical document, and a source of ongoing philosophical and ethical reflection.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to explore, so many layers to unpack. One thing that often intrigues people when they first encounter the Quran is the way God is presented.
Yeah?
It's not always straightforward, and sometimes it can even seem contradictory.
Okay. I'm curious, what do you mean by contradictory? Like, does God speak in the first person like, I am God?
Well, sometimes yes, but the Quran also uses the third person to refer to God, and even the royal we. This shifting perspective can be confusing at first, but it actually serves a rhetorical purpose.
So it's not just about conveying information. It's about creating a certain effect, a certain way of experiencing the divine.
Exactly. By using different pronouns and perspectives, the Quran emphasizes different aspects of God's nature. For example, the royal we might be used to highlight God's majesty and power, while the third person might create a sense of distance and awe.
It's like the language itself is reflecting the multifaceted nature of the divine. It's not trying to fit God into a neat little box.
You got it. And this linguistic complexity is something that's often lost in translation.
Right.
The Quran was revealed in Arabic, and the nuances of that language play a huge role in shaping its meaning.
It makes you realize that translating a text like the Quran, is more than just swapping words. It's about capturing the essence, the spirit of the original.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important to engage with the Quran on multiple levels, not just through translations, but also through commentaries, interpretations, and even artistic expressions inspired by it.
So it's not a closed book with a single fixed, meaning it's a living text that invites ongoing exploration and interpretation.
Exactly, and this openness to interpretation is part of what makes the Quran so relevant and adaptable across time and cultures.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one thing that always fascinated me about religious texts, especially the Quran, is how they grapple with big existential questions.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about monotheism and the afterlife, but what does the Quran say about the meaning of life? Like, what's our purpose here on earth?
Yeah, it's a question that's been pondered for centuries.
It is, and the Quran addresses it in various ways. One central idea is that humans are created as God's vicegerents on earth.
Okay.
We're given the responsibility to care for creation, to establish justice, and to live in accordance with God's will.
So it's not just about personal salvation. It's about our collective responsibility towards the world and each other.
Precisely. And this idea of responsibility ties into another key concept, free will.
Okay.
The Quran emphasizes that humans have been given the freedom to choose between right and wrong, and that our choices have consequences both in this life and the next.
So it's about making meaningful choices, living a life that aligns with our values, and ultimately being accountable for those choices. That's a pretty powerful concept.
It is, and it's one that challenges us to think deeply about our actions, our motivations, and our impact on the world around us.
You know, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the Quran's big ideas, its literary beauty, its historical context, and even some of its philosophical and ethical dimensions. What stands out to you as the most important takeaway for our listeners?
Well, what's fascinating to me is how the Quran manages to be both timeless and timely. Its core message of monotheism, submission to God, and living a righteous life has resonated with billions of people across centuries.
And at the same time, it's a text that speaks to the specific challenges and realities of its time, addressing issues of social justice, economic inequality, and even interfaith relations.
Exactly, and that's what makes the Quran such a dynamic and engaging text. It's not just a historical artifact. It's a living source of guidance, inspiration, and reflection.
So what does this all mean? What's fascinating to you about the Quran?
What I find particularly fascinating is how the Quran continues to be studied and interpreted by millions around the world. It invites ongoing dialogue and deeper reflection. Perhaps that's part of its enduring power.
If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to explore further. There's a whole world of knowledge waiting to be discovered within the pages of the Quran. Until next time, happy